March 15, 2024. Carlos Herrera had been Miguel's cook for 3 years. The boy Miguel called Mijo, my son. That's exactly why the bounty hunters paid him $2 million to make the call. 2 black SUVs rolled into Mazatlan at dawn. Carlos watched from the kitchen window as armed men surrounded the cantina. He'd already transferred the money, already booked his flight to Guatemala, already decided that $2 million was worth more than the old man's life. What happened in the next 12 hours became the most dangerous game of chess ever played between a fugitive DEA agent and a Supermax prisoner. The FBI launched emergency protocols because of it, and for years afterward, when people talked about loyalty and betrayal, they always came back to this morning. The morning Carlos made the call. The morning El Chapo proved that blood runs deeper than money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sonoran sun painted the adobe walls of Romano's kitchen in shades of amber and rust. Mac Valdez moved through his morning routine with the precision of a man who'd learned that structure could hold back the ghosts. Coffee first, dark roast, no sugar. Check the walk-in cooler, inventory the dry goods. The same ritual that had anchored him for 7 years in this desert sanctuary. His weathered hands, scarred from a lifetime of choices that cut both ways, arranged mise en place with the care of a man grateful for honest work. At 58, Marcus Mac Valdez had traded his DEA badge for an apron, his service weapon for chef's knives, his federal pension for the uncertain profits of a 30-seat restaurant that served the best carnitas in Tucson. The breakfast crowd would arrive soon, construction workers grabbing breakfast burritos, university students stretching their meal plans, retired snowbirds who'd discovered his green chile was worth the drive from their gated communities. They saw him as Mac the restaurateur, the quiet gringo who spoke flawless Spanish and never asked personal questions. They had no idea they were eating food prepared by the man who'd once been 3 seconds away from capturing the most wanted criminal in the Western Hemisphere. Elena's footsteps on the kitchen tiles pulled him from his thoughts. She moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd worked beside him long enough to anticipate his needs. Coffee was already brewing. The breakfast prep list was half finished. In 7 years, she'd never once disappointed him. "Buenos dias, hermano," she called, using the endearment that had become natural between them. Brother. It wasn't just friendship. It was the bond forged when he'd pulled her from a burning house in Sinaloa, when he'd helped her disappear from the cartel's reach, when he'd given her a new life in exchange for her silence about his old one. "Morning, Elena. Early again." Mac's voice carried the rough edges of a man who'd seen too much, but softened when he spoke to her. She was family in every way that mattered. Elena moved to the walk-in, grabbing eggs and chorizo for the morning special. Her movements seemed normal, routine, but something in the air felt different. A tension Mac couldn't identify, like the pressure drop before a monsoon storm. He hung his jacket on its usual hook by the back door, the same brown leather jacket he'd worn for 15 years, through raids and stakeouts and the kind of nights that changed men forever. The jacket that held the weight of his past in its inside pocket. The letter crinkled softly as he moved, a sound so familiar he barely noticed it anymore. 4 pages of elegant Spanish script on expensive paper, creased from years of folding and unfolding, stained with sweat and tears and the passage of time. The confession that had saved his life and destroyed his soul, written in the careful hand of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman himself. Mac had memorized every word, the acknowledgement of the debt between them, the explanation of why certain choices had been made on that October night 7 years ago in a Culiacan warehouse. The truth that 3 good agents had died because Mac Valdez had opened a door and looked the other way. He'd read it perhaps 1,000 times, this letter that proved he was either the most corrupt federal agent in DEA history or a father who'd made an impossible choice with a gun to his daughter's head, the letter that could destroy him or vindicate him, depending on who was reading. Elena worked quietly beside him, preparing vegetables with the knife skills he'd taught her. She'd been an accountant before the cartel wars consumed her old life, but her hands had learned the rhythm of the kitchen quickly. They worked in comfortable silence. the partnership of people who'd built something meaningful from the ashes of who they used to be. The first customers would arrive in an hour. The lunch rush would bring familiar faces and easy conversations about weather and football and anything except the past. Another day in the life Mac had constructed from discipline and deliberate forgetting. He had no way of knowing that 3 photos had already been uploaded to an encrypted server in Mexico City. No way of knowing that a journalist's bank account in the Caymans had just grown by 6 figures. No way of knowing that in 72 hours, presidents would be reading El Chapo's elegant handwriting while DEA task forces mobilized and cartel lieutenants reached for their phones. Mac Valdez chopped onions for the salsa verde and watched steam rise from the morning coffee. The kitchen smelled like cumin and hope. Outside, Tucson was waking up to another November morning in the desert, where the past stayed buried, and a man could build a new life from masa and determination. He had perhaps 4 hours left before everything he'd built would start to burn. The coffee was perfect. The prep list was on schedule. Elena hummed softly while she worked, the same Mexican ballad she'd hummed every morning for 7 years. Everything felt exactly the same. Everything had already changed forever. The humming stopped. Mac's knife paused mid-chop, onion juice stinging his eyes as he glanced toward Elena. She stood frozen at the prep station, her back to him, shoulders rigid in a way that made his old instincts whisper warnings. 7 years of shared mornings had taught him to read her moods like weather patterns. Today felt like the stillness before lightning strikes. "Elena, you okay?" She turned, and for a moment her face carried an expression he'd never seen before. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Then it was gone, replaced by the familiar smile that had greeted him every morning since he'd pulled her from that burning house in Sinaloa. Sí, por supuesto. Just tired. Her knife resumed its rhythm against the cutting board, but the melody didn't return. Mac wanted to press, but the breakfast crowd was already stirring beyond the kitchen doors. Mrs. Patterson would arrive in 20 minutes for her usual. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, coffee black enough to strip paint. Then the university kids, the construction crews, the slow parade of regulars who'd become the closest thing to community he'd known since leaving federal service. This restaurant wasn't just his livelihood, it was his resurrection. He'd built Hermano's kitchen the same way addicts built sobriety, one day at a time, with the desperate focus of a man who knew what waited in the alternative. Every recipe perfected, every customer relationship cultivated, every morning routine executed with the precision that had once made him one of the DEA's most effective agents. Before Culiacan, before the warehouse, before the night that divided his life into before and after. The coffee maker gurgled, filling the silence with familiar comfort. Mac inhaled deeply, dark roast mingling with cilantro and lime, the scents that had become his sanctuary. This kitchen had saved him when sleep brought nightmares and mirrors reflected ghosts. When the weight of 3 dead agents pressed against his chest like stones. "Remember when we first opened?" Mac asked, needing to fill the strange quiet that had settled between them. "You burned every batch of rice for a week." Elena's laugh came too quickly, too bright. "You said I cooked like an accountant trying to balance ingredients instead of understanding them. But you learned. Hell, your mole is better than my grandmother's was." He meant it. Elena had thrown herself into cooking with the same desperate energy he'd brought to forgetting. They were both refugees from their former selves. He from the weight of impossible choices, she from cartel violence that had claimed her husband and brother. The kitchen had become their shared therapy, a place where past sins could be transformed into something nourishing. Mac's phone buzzed against his hip. A text from Tommy Hernandez, his part-time server, calling in sick. Again. The kid was reliable when he wasn't nursing hangovers, but Mac would need to cover the front of house during lunch. He made a mental note to call Maria Santos. She'd been looking for extra shifts. "I'll handle tables today," he told Elena. "Tommy's out." "Bueno. You're better with the customers anyway." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The bell above the front door chimed as the first customer of the day pushed inside. Mac wiped his hands on his apron and headed toward the dining room, leaving Elena alone with her prep and whatever shadows had stolen her morning song. The dining room was his pride. 28 tables arranged to catch the desert light streaming through tall windows, Walls decorated with Mexican pottery and local artwork. Nothing too fancy, but everything clean and welcoming. This space represented something he'd never had during his federal years: permanence. Roots that went deeper than the next assignment, the next undercover operation, the next chance to get himself killed in service to a war that never seemed to end. Mrs. Patterson settled into her usual booth, already reaching for the coffee he poured without being asked. She was 83, a retired teacher who'd been coming here since his second week in business. Her late husband had been a Border Patrol agent. She understood the look in Mac's eyes even if she'd never asked about its source. "How's Elena doing?" she asked, stirring cream into her coffee. "She seemed upset yesterday." Mac paused, pot hovering over her cup. "Upset how?" "Distracted. Worried about something. You know how women get when we're chewing on a problem." He filed the observation away with the morning's other small mysteries. Elena had been acting strange for several days now, checking her phone more often, jumping when deliveries arrived, that distant look when she thought he wasn't watching. He'd attributed it to stress, maybe family trouble she didn't want to burden him with. The breakfast rush built slowly, each familiar face a reminder of the life he'd constructed from careful choices and deliberate normalcy. Roberto from the auto shop, Sarah from the law firm downtown, the retired professor who always ordered in perfect Spanish and tipped like he was apologizing for something. These people knew him as Mac the cook, Mac the small business owner who remembered their preferences and asked about their grandchildren. They had no idea they were eating food prepared by a man who'd once stood in a warehouse in Culiacan with a gun in his hand and a choice that would haunt him forever. A choice that lived now in 4 pages of elegant script, hidden in his jacket pocket like a loaded weapon waiting for someone to pull the trigger. The morning rhythm shattered at 10:47 a.m. Mac was refilling coffee for the breakfast stragglers when his phone rang, not the gentle buzz of a text, but the sharp insistence of an actual call. He glanced at the screen and felt his blood turn to ice water. The number displayed was one he'd memorized 15 years ago, one that had been burned into federal databases and international watch lists, one that belonged to a dead man's satellite phone. Joaquin Guzman was calling him. "Excuse me," Mac muttered to Mrs. Patterson, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. He walked toward the kitchen on legs that felt disconnected from his body, thumb hovering over the answer button. This was impossible. El Chapo had been in ADX Florence for 4 years, locked in a cell designed to hold the world's most dangerous criminals. No phone calls, no contact with the outside world, unless this wasn't about the man in the cell. Mac answered on the 5th ring. "Marcus." The voice was younger than El Chapo's, but carried the same measured authority. Perfect English with just a trace of Sinaloa accent. "You know who this is?" "I know the number." Mac stepped into the walk-in cooler, where the industrial humming would mask his conversation. "The man who used it is in a concrete box in Colorado. My father sends his regards. He also sends his disappointment. Father." The word hit Mac like a physical blow. Ivan Archivaldo Guzman, El Chapo's eldest son, had inherited more than just the Sinaloa organization. He'd inherited his father's meticulous memory and his talent for psychological warfare. "I've been retired for 7 years, Mac said. "Whatever disappointment your father feels, it's ancient history. History has a way of becoming current events, especially when people betray trust." The voice carried no emotion, which made it infinitely more terrifying than rage would have been. "Someone has taken something that belongs to our family. 3 photographs, a certain letter written in my father's hand." The walk-in cooler suddenly felt like a tomb. Mac's breath came out in visible puffs as understanding crashed over him like a collapsing building. The letter. Someone had photographed El Chapo's confession, the letter that detailed everything about that night in Culiacan, the impossible choice, the reason 3 agents had died. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't. But perhaps you should ask your trusted friend about her new bank account in the Cayman Islands. $100,000 is a substantial sum for someone who makes $12 an hour. Elena." The name exploded in Mac's mind with the force of betrayal made real. 7 years of shared mornings, shared stories, shared silence about the past they'd both fled. 7 years of trust, and she'd sold him for money. The photographs were uploaded to a secure server yesterday evening. Ivan continued with the same clinical detachment. By tomorrow, they will be in the hands of journalists who believe they have the story of the decade. The corrupt DEA agent who let El Chapo escape. The confession that proves Marcus Valdez is a traitor to his own country. Mac's hand found the wall of the cooler, cold metal against his palm, grounding him, in a moment that felt like falling through space. Through the small window in the door, he could see Elena at her prep station, knife moving in steady rhythm, humming resumed as if nothing had changed, as if she hadn't just destroyed both their lives. "What do you want?" Mac's voice came out hoarse. "Justice. The photographs will be retrieved, the server will be cleaned, and the person responsible for this betrayal will learn that some trusts, once broken, carry permanent consequences. Leave Elena alone. This is between us." "Nothing is between us, Marcus. Everything is between families." The pause carried weight that made Mac's chest tighten. "But perhaps you've forgotten. Perhaps 7 years of playing restaurant owner has made you forget that you still have family that matters." The line went dead. Mac stood in the freezing cooler, phone trembling in his grip, as the full magnitude of the disaster crashed over him. Elena had photographed the letter, sold it to journalists. In hours, maybe days, his face would be on every news channel in America as the corrupt agent who'd let the world's most wanted criminal escape. But worse than exposure, worse than the federal task forces that would be mobilizing, worse than the end of his carefully constructed life, was the ice-cold certainty in Ivan's voice when he'd mentioned family. They knew about someone Mac had tried to forget, someone whose existence had been buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was just another nightmare. His daughter was dead, had been dead for 7 years, but her son, Mac's grandson, was not. Mac stumbled out of the cooler, his legs unsteady, the phone still clutched in his white-knuckled grip. The kitchen felt alien now, the familiar sounds of sizzling oil and chopping knives transformed into something menacing. Elena stood exactly where he'd left her, her knife working through onions with mechanical precision, but everything had changed. $100,000. The number echoed in his skull like a death sentence. Elena. His voice cracked on her name. She looked up, and for a split second he saw it, the flash of guilt, the fear, the knowledge of what she'd done. Then her mask slipped back into place, the concerned expression of a friend worried about his pallor. "Dios mío, Mac, you look terrible. What happened?" He wanted to believe the concern was real. Wanted to pretend the last 7 years hadn't been built on quicksand, that the woman who'd become his sister hadn't sold his life for money. But Ivan's words rang with the brutal clarity of truth. "We need to talk. After closing." "Of course. Whatever you need." Her voice carried the same warmth it always had, but now Mac heard the deception underneath, the careful performance of someone who'd already chosen her side. The lunch rush arrived like a blessing and a curse. Mac moved through the dining room in a daze, pouring coffee and taking orders while his mind reeled. Every customer could be a federal agent. Every phone camera could be capturing his face for comparison with the photographs that would soon be everywhere. The paranoia he'd spent 7 years burying clawed its way back to the surface with savage intensity. "You okay, hermano?" Roberto from the auto shop asked, as Mac delivered his usual carne asada plate with extra salsa. "You seem distracted. Just tired." Mac forced a smile that felt like broken glass. Long morning. But Roberto's eyes lingered, the way eyes did when something felt wrong. Mac had forgotten how quickly suspicion spread, how people could sense danger even when they couldn't name it. In his federal days, that instinct had kept him alive. Now it might destroy him. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "The photos are already moving. 72 hours until publication. Thought you should know. A friend." Mac's hands shook as he deleted the message. 72 hours. 3 days until his face was on every news channel in America, until federal task forces started mobilizing, until his carefully constructed life turned to ash. He needed to run. Pack the emergency bag he'd kept ready for 7 years, and disappear into the network of safe houses and false identities he'd maintained out of habit and paranoia. Become someone else, somewhere else, the way he'd planned 1,000 sleepless nights. But Ivan's words echoed, "You still have family that matters." Mac's daughter, Carmen, had been 22 when the cartels took her. Brilliant, stubborn, pursuing her master's degree in social work because she wanted to help people. She'd inherited his sense of justice and his inability to look away from suffering. It had gotten her killed. But before she died, she'd had a son, a boy Mac had never met, whose existence had been hidden from him until it was too late to matter, a grandson who would be 8 years old now if he was still alive. If the Guzman family had kept their word about protection, the thought of running felt like acid in his throat. How could he abandon a child who carried his blood? How could he repeat the failure that had cost Carmen her life? Mac? Elena appeared beside him, her hand touching his shoulder with familiar concern. "You're scaring the customers. Maybe you should take a break." He looked at her, really looked, and saw a stranger wearing the face of his closest friend. The Elena he'd known would never have betrayed him for money, but that Elena was either dead or had never existed at all. "I'm fine." He pulled away from her touch. "No, you're not. You haven't been fine since..." "Since when?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "Since yesterday? Since last week? Since you decided I was worth $100,000? Her face went white. For a moment the mask dropped completely, and he saw naked terror in her eyes. Not fear of him, fear of something else, someone else. "Mac, She glanced around the dining room, lowering her voice. "I can't. Not here. Tonight. After we close." She turned and fled toward the kitchen, leaving Mac standing in the middle of his restaurant with the crushing realization that everything he'd built was already gone. The customers continued eating, unaware that they were dining in the ruins of a dead man's dream. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. "Elena isn't the enemy. But she's not your friend either. Watch your back. They're coming." Mac deleted the message and tried to breathe. 72 hours until the world learned his name again, until the hunters became the hunted. And somewhere out there, a grandson he'd never held was counting on him to make the right choice this time. Mac moved through his restaurant like a ghost haunting his own life, each familiar routine now poisoned by the knowledge that Elena had photographed El Chapo's letter, the confession that would destroy him, the truth about Culiacan that he'd carried like shrapnel in his chest for 7 years. $100,000. The sum kept echoing in his mind. How long had she planned this? How many mornings had she stood beside him, sharing coffee and quiet conversation, while calculating the price of his betrayal? At 3:15, the lunch crowd finally thinned. Mac found himself alone in the dining room, methodically wiping down tables while his mind spiraled through increasingly desperate scenarios. He could run, disappear into the network of safe houses and false identities he'd maintained like insurance policies. But Ivan's words haunted him. You still have family that matters. His grandson, Carmen's son. A boy who existed because of a choice Mac's daughter had made before the cartels murdered her. A choice she'd never lived to tell him about. The guilt was a familiar weight, but today it felt heavier. Carmen had died because Mac had made enemies, because his work with the DEA had painted a target on everyone he loved. And now, 7 years later, his past was reaching out to claim another generation. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, another cryptic message. "The photos are moving faster than expected. Less than 72 hours now. Your location is compromised. Move." Max stared at the words until they blurred. Someone was watching him, tracking the progress of his destruction in real time. But who? And why were they warning him? The kitchen door swung open, and Elena emerged carrying a bus tub full of dirty dishes. She moved with forced normalcy, but Mac could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes avoided his. 7 years of shared mornings, and he'd never noticed how well she could lie. "Elena." His voice came out rougher than intended. She stopped, the dishes rattling slightly in her grip. "Mac, please, not here." "When then?" "When the FBI kicks down my door. When your journalists publish their story." Her face crumpled for just a moment, real anguish breaking through the careful mask. "You don't understand. They said they would..." "Kill you?" Mac stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Welcome to my world. The difference is, I never sold my friends to save myself." "Your friends?" Elena's voice cracked with something between desperation and rage. "You think we're friends? You think I don't know what you did in Mexico? What you've been hiding?" The words hit Mac like a physical blow. She knew, not just about the letter, about everything. About the warehouse in Culiacan, about the choice he'd made, about the 3 agents who died because he'd let El Chapo walk away. How long have you known? 3 years. Maybe 4. Elena set down the bus tub with shaking hands. Do you remember Miguel Herrera, my cousin who worked for the Guadalajara office? Mac remembered. A young analyst who'd been killed in a car bombing outside Tijuana. Elena had taken 2 weeks off for the funeral. Miguel left me letters before he died. Insurance, he called it. Information about corrupt agents, about deals made in the dark. Her voice dropped to barely audible. Your name was in those files, Mac. Your real story. The restaurant felt like it was tilting around Mac, reality shifting on its axis. Elena hadn't discovered his secret recently. She'd been living with it for years. Every shared meal, every quiet conversation, every moment of apparent friendship had been built on this lie. So why now? Why wait 3 years to destroy me? Because I thought you were different. Tears tracked down Elena's cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Miguel's files said you were dirty, but I watched you. How you treated people. How you built this place. I thought maybe the files were wrong. And then I found the letter. El Chapo's actual handwriting, describing exactly what Miguel had written. How you let him escape. How 3 agents died because of your choice. Her voice turned bitter. I realized I'd been living with a murderer. The accusation hung between them like a blade. Mac felt the familiar weight of those 3 names. Agent Sarah Chen, Agent Roberto Vasquez, Agent Michael Torres. Good people who trusted his judgment and died for it. You don't know the whole story. I know enough. Elena wiped her eyes with savage efficiency. The journalists will publish in 60 hours. Maybe less. They're calling it the biggest DEA corruption scandal in 20 years. 60 hours. Even less time than he'd thought. Mac felt the walls of his carefully constructed life collapsing inward. But underneath the panic was something else. Relief. 7 years of carrying this secret, and soon the weight would be gone, except for his grandson. Somewhere out there, a boy who'd never asked to inherit this legacy was counting on Mac to protect him. The way Mac had failed to protect Carmen. There's more to this than revenge or money, Mac said quietly. Someone's been pulling strings. Using you. Elena's laugh was hollow. You think I'm stupid? Of course someone's been pulling strings. The question is whether you care more about saving yourself or saving the boy. Mac's blood turned to ice. What boy? Elena's smile held no warmth. Your grandson, Marcus. Did you really think El Chapo's family would keep that secret forever? The world tilted completely off its axis, and Mac realized that everything, Elena's betrayal, the photographed letter, even this conversation, had been orchestrated. His grandson wasn't just in danger. He was the trap. Mac's vision grayed at the edges as Elena's words detonated in his mind like a flashbang grenade. The restaurant around him, his sanctuary, his carefully constructed new life, seemed to dissolve into something alien and threatening. You know about David. His voice came out as barely a whisper. Elena's expression shifted, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely surprised. David? His name is David? The slip hit Mac like ice water. Elena knew about his grandson's existence, but she didn't know his name, which meant someone else was feeding her information, someone who knew just enough to manipulate her, but not everything. Who told you about the boy, Elena? She backed away, her face cycling through confusion, fear, and something that looked almost like relief. The journalist, Rebecca Martinez from the Phoenix Tribune, she said the Guzman family had leverage over you, a grandson you'd never acknowledged. Mac's mind raced. Rebecca Martinez, he knew that name from his federal days, an investigative reporter who'd made her career exposing corruption, always careful with her sources, always thorough with verification, but this time she was being played. When did Martinez first contact you? 6 weeks ago. She said she'd been investigating your background, that she had evidence of DEA corruption going back years. Elena's voice grew smaller. She offered me money for information. Just background at first. What you were like, your routines, your habits. 6 weeks. Mac felt the timeline clicking into place like bullets loading into a chamber. 6 weeks ago, El Chapo's legal appeals had been exhausted. 6 weeks ago, even Archivaldo had consolidated his control over the Sinaloa organization. And 6 weeks ago, someone had decided it was time to collect on an old debt. She never mentioned the letter until last week, Elena continued, tears flowing freely now. She said she knew it existed, that she had sources who could confirm its authenticity if I could provide photographs. And you believed her? I wanted to believe her. Elena's voice cracked. Do you know what it's been like, Mac? Knowing what you did? Watching you play the reformed hero while 3 families still grieve their dead children? I convinced myself that maybe, if the truth came out, those families could have justice. Mac studied Elena's face and saw something that made his chest tighten. Genuine anguish. She wasn't just a traitor motivated by greed. She was a woman who'd been carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, manipulated by someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to press. The money wasn't the point, he said, understanding flooding through him. The money was proof that someone else believed the story mattered. Elena wiped her eyes with her sleeve. $100,000 meant this wasn't just my cousin's paranoid accusations. It meant someone with real resources thought you deserved to be exposed. Mac pulled out his phone and showed her the message he'd received. Elena isn't the enemy. But she's not your friend either. Watch your back. They're coming. Elena read the text, her face going white. Who sent this? Someone who wants me to know that you and I are both being played. Mac pocketed the phone. Think, Elena. How did Martinez know about the letter? El Chapo wrote it in solitary confinement and had it smuggled out through channels that cost more than most people make in a lifetime. The only people who knew it existed were Ivan, me, and whoever delivered it. Elena's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned. She said her source was unimpeachable, someone with direct access to cartel communications. Because her source is the cartel. Mac felt pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Ivan doesn't want to stop the story. He wants to control it. Use it as cover for something bigger. But why involve me? Why not just release the photos themselves? Mac's phone rang before he could answer. Unknown number, but he recognized the pattern now. He answered on speaker. Marcus. Rebecca Martinez's voice was crisp, professional, tinged with the excitement of a reporter who believed she had the story of her career. I assume you've spoken with Elena by now. I'm here, Elena said, her voice barely steady. Excellent. We need to meet. Tonight. There's been a development that changes everything. Mac and Elena exchanged glances. What kind of development? Your grandson Marcus, David Hernandez, 8 years old, currently attending St. Catherine's Elementary in Hermosillo. Martinez's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who didn't understand the weapon she was wielding. According to my sources, he's been under cartel protection since his mother's death, but that protection comes with conditions. The floor seemed to drop away beneath Mac's feet. Hermosillo was barely 3 hours south of Tucson. For 7 years, his grandson had been living close enough to visit, and Mac had never known. The boy is why you made your choice in Culiacan, Martinez continued. And he's why you're going to make another choice now. Do we meet tonight and tell this story properly, or do I publish what I have and let federal authorities sort out the rest? Mac closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 7 years of carefully maintained distance collapsing into a single, impossible moment. Someone had been orchestrating this from the beginning, using Elena's guilt, Martinez's ambition, and Mac's love for a grandson he'd never held. But Rebecca Martinez had just made a crucial mistake. She'd revealed that she thought David was the leverage that had controlled Mac in Culiacan. She was wrong. And that wrongness was the first advantage Mac had found in this carefully constructed trap. His daughter Carmen had already been dead when he let El Chapo escape. The boy's existence hadn't motivated Mac's choice. It had been El Chapo's gift afterward, a gesture of respect from one father to another, which meant someone had been lying to Martinez about the timeline. Someone who wanted her to believe a false narrative about Mac's motivations. Someone who was about to learn that Marcus Valdez hadn't survived 7 years of hiding by being predictable. We'll meet, Mac said quietly. But not where you expect. Mac ended the call and stared at Elena, seeing his own realization reflected in her tear-stained face. They weren't adversaries anymore. They were both pieces on someone else's board, moved by hands they'd never seen. "We need to get out of here," he said. "Now." Elena nodded, then hesitated. "Mac, the letter. I still have the photos. I could delete them." Too late. Martinez already has copies, and her source has the original timeline they want to sell. He moved toward the back office, muscle memory taking over. 7 years of preparation had taught him to think 3 moves ahead. But there's something Martinez doesn't know. Something that changes everything. Mac pulled his emergency bag from behind the false panel in his office wall. Cash, documents, a clean phone, and the .45 he'd hoped never to touch again. The weight felt familiar and terrible in his hands. "Carmen was already dead when I made my choice in Culiacan," he said, checking the magazine. The boy wasn't leverage, he was a gift. El Chapo kept David alive out of respect, not control. Elena's eyes widened as the implications hit her. So whoever's feeding Martinez information is selling her a lie. Mac shouldered the bag, his movements sharp and efficient. "They want her to believe David was my weakness in 2016. But the truth is messier. I let El Chapo escape because 3 agents were already dying, and I couldn't save them and maintain our cover. I chose the mission over my team." The confession felt like tearing off scar tissue. Elena stared at him with something between horror and understanding. Then why keep David's secret? Why the protection? Mac's throat tightened. "Because after Carmen died, El Chapo sent me a message. Said he'd made a mistake taking my daughter, that she was innocent. The boy would be safe as long as I stayed quiet. Honor among killers. But now someone's breaking that arrangement. Someone who wants to use Martinez's story as cover for eliminating David. Clean up the last loose end from Culiacan." Mac headed for the back door, then stopped. "Elena, I need to know, are you with them or are you with me?" She looked around the restaurant, at the life they'd built together from lies and half-truths. When she spoke, her voice was steady for the first time all day. "I photographed the letter because I thought you were a corrupt agent who got people killed for money." She grabbed her purse and followed him. "But you're not corrupt. You're just broken. And that boy doesn't deserve to pay for choices adults made before he was born." Mac felt something loosen in his chest. Not forgiveness, but understanding. Elena had betrayed him, but she'd been manipulated by people who understood exactly how to weaponize guilt and justice. They slipped out through the kitchen, leaving Mac's diner unlocked and undefended. 7 years of careful normalcy abandoned in the space of a breath. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as they reached Mac's truck. "Somewhere Martinez won't expect." Mac started the engine, his mind already running through routes and contingencies. "But first, we're going to visit someone who can tell us exactly who's been pulling Rebecca Martinez's strings." "Who?" Mac's smile held no warmth. Martinez said her source was unimpeachable, someone with direct access to cartel communications. But there are only 3 people alive who knew the real timeline of what happened in Culiacan: El Chapo, me, and the man who delivered that letter. Elena gripped the door handle as Mac pulled into traffic. "You know who delivered it?" "Tommy Vasquez, Roberto's older brother. Former Marine, current smuggler, and the only man stupid enough to carry messages between cartel bosses and federal agents." Mac turned south, toward the border. He's also Martinez's source, and he's about to learn what happens when you try to get a child killed for revenge. As they drove through Tucson's late afternoon traffic, Mac's phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number. "Smart choice. But you're still thinking too small. This isn't about justice or revenge. It's about succession. David isn't just El Chapo's protected asset. He's Ivan's insurance policy, and someone wants to cash it in." Mac showed Elena the message. She read it twice, her face growing pale. Insurance policy for what? "For the one thing worth more than money or revenge in the cartel world," Mac said grimly. "Legitimacy. David is El Chapo's protected ward, raised under cartel care. If Ivan can present him as family, as proof of the organization's honor, it solidifies his claim to leadership." Elena's voice was barely a whisper. "And if David dies while under that protection, Ivan looks weak. His enemies move against him. The Sinaloa organization fractures." Mac pressed harder on the accelerator, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. Someone's planning a war, Elena, and they're using us to light the fuse. The address Tommy Vasquez had given them led to a warehouse in South Tucson, the kind of place where legitimate businesses went to die. Mac parked across the street, studying the building through the gathering dusk. 3 vehicles in the lot, lights on in the office section, and the unmistakable silhouette of armed men moving behind tinted windows. "This feels like a trap," Elena whispered. "Everything's been a trap since this started." Mac checked his, 45 one last time, the weight both foreign and familiar in his hands. The question is whose trap it really is. As they crossed the empty street, Mac's phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "Tommy's not your enemy tonight. The woman with him is—" Mac showed Elena the text as they reached the warehouse entrance. She read it, her face going pale in the fluorescent security lighting. What woman? Before Mac could answer, the door opened from inside. Tommy Vasquez stood in the doorway, older than Mac remembered, carrying new scars and the hollow-eyed look of a man who'd seen too much death. Behind him, in the warehouse's harsh lighting, sat Rebecca Martinez at a metal table covered with documents and photographs. "Marcus." Tommy's voice carried the weight of 8 years and a brother's grave. "Been wondering when you'd show up." Mac stepped inside, Elena close behind him. The warehouse smelled of motor oil and something else. Fear, maybe, or the metallic tang that preceded violence. Martinez looked up from her papers with the sharp attention of a predator who'd been waiting for prey to arrive. "Mr. Valdez, thank you for coming." She gestured to chairs across from her. "Please, sit. We have a lot to discuss." Mac remained standing, his eyes moving between Tommy and Martinez, reading the tension in their body language. These weren't allies. They were 2 people using each other, each believing they held the stronger hand. "You've been feeding Martinez information," Mac said to Tommy. "Using her to flush me out." Tommy's laugh was bitter. "You still think this is about you? Still think you're the center of everyone else's universe? Then what's it about?" "It's about Roberto." Tommy pulled a photograph from his jacket, his younger brother in DEA gear, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who believed justice mattered. "He trusted you, Marcus, looked up to you, and you got him killed for a drug dealer's gratitude." The accusation hit Mac like a physical blow, but he forced himself to stay steady. 8 years of carrying guilt had taught him to function through pain. Roberto died because the operation went bad, because intelligence was compromised, and we walked into an ambush. "Intelligence you compromised." Martinez spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she held all the facts. "When you made your deal with El Chapo." Mac studied her face, the certainty, the righteous anger, the complete conviction that she understood the truth. Rebecca Martinez wasn't just a journalist chasing a story. She was a true believer, which made her infinitely more dangerous than mere ambition. "Show me your timeline," Mac said quietly. Martinez spread photographs across the table like tarot cards revealing fate. The letter from El Chapo, surveillance photos of Mac in Culiacan, documented meetings between cartel figures and federal agents, a complete narrative of corruption and betrayal, meticulously assembled and absolutely wrong. "According to my sources, you made contact with Guzman's people 3 weeks before the warehouse raid. Arranged safe passage in exchange for your daughter's location." Martinez's voice carried prosecutorial weight. "Your team walked into that ambush because you'd already sold them out." Elena moved closer to the table, studying the photographs. Mac saw her face change as she processed what she was seeing. Not just evidence, but the careful construction of evidence, designed to support a predetermined conclusion. "The dates are wrong," Elena said softly. Tommy and Martinez both turned to stare at her. Mac felt his pulse spike as Elena stepped fully into the light, her face set with new determination. "I've been researching Mac's story for months. Carmen Valdez was killed 6 weeks before the warehouse raid, not after." Elena's voice grew stronger. If this timeline is correct, Mac was negotiating with cartels while his daughter was still alive and safe. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Martinez looked between Elena and her photographs, the certainty cracking around her edges. Tommy's hand moved toward his jacket, not reaching for a weapon yet, but preparing. Mac felt the moment crystallizing around them. all the lies and manipulations finally colliding with simple truth. Someone had fed Martinez a carefully constructed false narrative, and that someone was about to be exposed. "Who gave you this timeline, Rebecca?" Mac asked quietly. Martinez's eyes darted toward Tommy, then back to her papers. The confidence was draining from her face like water from a broken vessel. Tommy verified everything. He was there, he saw. "I saw what they wanted me to see." Tommy's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Just like you're seeing what they want you to see." The warehouse suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as 8 years of carefully maintained lies began their final collapse. The truth hung in the warehouse air like smoke from a dying fire. Martinez stared at her carefully arranged evidence, photographs that had seemed so damning moments before now revealing themselves as elaborate fiction. Her hands trembled as she gathered the papers, the journalist's certainty crumbling into something raw and more human. "I trusted you," she whispered to Tommy, but he was already moving toward the door, the weight of his own deceptions finally too much to bear. "You trusted the story you wanted to hear," Tommy said without turning back. "Same as I did. Same as we all did." Elena stepped forward, her voice gentle now. "Rebecca, who really gave you this timeline?" Martinez's composure shattered completely. A man named Ivan said he had proof that agents like Marcus were still protecting cartel interests, said the families deserved justice. She looked up at Mac with something approaching apology. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Mac felt the familiar ache of recognizing good intentions twisted into weapons. How many times had he seen honorable people manipulated by those who understood exactly which emotional buttons to press? "The boy," he said quietly. "David. Where is he really?" Martinez pulled out her phone with shaking hands, scrolling through messages. "Hermosillo. At least that's what I was told. But now..." She looked at the fabricated timeline, understanding dawning. "Now I don't know what's true anymore." The warehouse door opened again, but this time it was Elena who moved toward it. She paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the desert night. "I can't be part of this anymore," she said. "Any of this. The restaurant, the lies, the endless weight of secrets." She looked back at Mac one final time. "I hope you find your grandson. I hope he's safe. But I'm done carrying other people's guilt." Mac watched her disappear into the darkness, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. Elena had been right to leave. Some burdens couldn't be shared, only carried by those who'd earned them. "What happens now?" Martinez asked. Mac gathered the photographs, the false timeline, the carefully constructed evidence of crimes that had never happened the way anyone believed. 8 years of running, of hiding, of letting others define his choices. It was time to write his own ending. "Now I find David," he said. "Not because El Chapo protected him, not because someone's using him as leverage, but because he's my family, the only family I have left." Tommy had stopped at the door, his brother's photograph still clutched in his weathered hands. "Roberto would have done the same thing you did, Marcus. In the warehouse, I mean. He would have tried to save everyone and ended up saving no one." The admission felt like absolution, though Mac knew he didn't deserve it. "That doesn't make it right. No. But it makes it human." 3 weeks later, Mac stood outside St. Catherine's Elementary in Hermosillo, watching children stream from the building in the controlled chaos of dismissal time. He'd found David through patience rather than violence, quiet inquiries, small bribes, the steady application of skills he'd hoped never to use again. The boy emerged with a group of friends, 8 years old and laughing at something one of them had whispered. He had Carmen's eyes and Mac's stubborn jawline, and for a moment the resemblance was so strong that Mac had to grip the fence to stay upright. David Hernandez didn't know his grandfather existed, didn't know about the choices made in his name, the protection arranged by killers, the journalists and agents and grieving brothers who'd tried to use his existence for their own purposes. He was simply a child walking home from school, carrying a backpack covered in cartoon characters and the innocent weight of homework instead of legacy. Mac watched until the boy disappeared around a corner, then turned and walked back to his truck. The letter from El Chapo was still in his jacket pocket, not destroyed, but no longer defining him. Some stories were meant to stay unfinished. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but this time Mac didn't check it. The game of hidden messages and manipulated truths was over. Rebecca Martinez had published a retraction. Tommy Vasquez had disappeared back into whatever shadows had birthed him, and Elena was building something new from the ruins of what they'd shared. As for Mac, he drove north toward the border, toward whatever remained of Marcus Valdez after 8 years of being someone else. Behind him, Hermosillo settled into evening, and somewhere in that fading light, a boy named David did his homework and remained innocent for one more day. It wasn't justice, it wasn't redemption, but it was enough, the knowledge that some choices, however costly, had protected something worth protecting. In the end, that understanding would have to serve as both punishment and peace.